Hey everyone, my name is Paul Schmitz. I'm with the Collective Impact Forum. I'm based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, over in the US. And I'm so sorry I can't be in person with you all in Helsinki. I was really looking forward to that, but excited that I still, even this virtual environment, get to share some of my thinking and experience on collective impact with you today. And I'll look forward to also answering questions shortly. I'm going to bring up some slides. What I'm going to be talking about today is about what collective impact is, and also what's the culture, what do you have to put in place in order for collective impact to work well. And I'm going to use some stories and some examples that I hope translate well. I'll try to remind myself to speak clearly and a little more slowly, recognizing that I'm a fast talker as a rule. But I'm, again, just so excited to be able to share this work with you and hope I get to visit you someday. I want to start with just a recognition of the time we're in. 2020 for all of us around the world has been a year just filled with immense challenges. I heard a song recently from an artist I love that's called "It's Been a Bad Day Lately," and it seems like that especially for those of us here in the United States. We've had the pandemic, and of course, all of the illness, and here in my country, over 200,000 people dead. Just in my city of Milwaukee, which is a population in our county of about 1 million people, we've had over 28,000 cases, and we've had almost 500 die just in my community. It's a continued concern. We've had our children having to educate in a virtual environment here in many cities like mine, and kids getting really frustrated with having to learn in completely new ways in school completely differently. Here we've had an economic fallout, over 30 million people unemployed, and lines for food, which we haven't seen in decades. We've had a movement for Black lives that continues and has captivated the nation, but also polarized the nation, as there are many people who don't support the aims of Black Lives Matter, while it seems a majority of the country does. And the marches have been probably the most inspiring and sustained movement we've had in a long time. We've had recent forest fires, and then of course we have this. That's all I'll say about this. We have this, and which has not helped unite or solve many of the problems we're facing in the country right now. So the question I just want to start with, because a lot of my focus and work is on leadership, is how do you lead in such a crazy environment? And I would imagine that those of you in Finland are dealing with some of the same concerns that we are here. And one of the things I've been saying to people is, first, it's okay to not be okay, that it's just a hard time and we're struggling in lots of ways. And that people shouldn't feel bad when they feel bad, because we're struggling and wrestling with a lot of different issues, and it's difficult. The second thing is we have to really lean into empathy in our homes and at our work, that everyone experiences this differently. I'm an introvert, so kind of turtling in and spending my time at home is not hard. I miss the road. I wish I could be with you. But for others, it's really hard. And a lot of people, again, facing economic concerns and health concerns, family concerns. So we really have to recognize the difficulty people have. I don't know about you, but there's a good chance while I'm recording this, some kid's going to come into my office and ask me a question. And we just have to roll with it and be empathetic with each other's experience. We're all trying to manage as best we can. We have to practice self-care. When we get on an airplane, at least here, the announcement they make is that before you put an oxygen mask on anyone else, make sure to put your own oxygen mask on. And I believe that's true in this case, that as those of us in leadership roles, we have to make sure we're taking care of our physical health, our mental health, and doing whatever we need to do. For me, it's been cooking. It's been exercising a lot more. It's been playing a lot more guitar and reading a lot more, and just doing things to kind of keep myself centered and keep myself okay so that I can better support and others. Having a plan if you or your family gets sick, and this is something that's come up here more and more, is just the notion that a lot of people haven't thought through what would happen in their organizations or their work or their families. And it's important that you have a plan, that you have an idea. For those of us who are pursuing strategies to move population goals on issues like education and public health and poverty and crime and other things, the reality is this has been a massively disruptive event. And for many of us, we're not going to achieve the outcomes we identified for this year, and we should be okay with that and recognize that that's just the reality. And this year is going to have a big star next to it on every map because the data for this year is just going to be off from every other year because of all the other external challenges that we're all facing. That we have to really pay attention to our most vulnerable populations here in the United States. The coronavirus and COVID-19 have disproportionately affected African-American and Latino communities. They have disproportionately affected poor communities. The economic changes and the unemployment has predominantly hit those in service industries and those who are the lowest paid. And so what we recognize is our most vulnerable populations are facing the brunt of these challenges. And then on top of that, here you add the racism and the racist police killings, and just recognize that our communities are in a lot of pain, and we've got to make special attention to those communities. We have to learn, adapt, and create to a new normal that a lot of groups that have shifted their work because of the pandemic are going to eventually migrate back to their strategies, but recognize that what we're seeing as a result of this pandemic is a lot of systems and things that didn't work well. And we don't want to migrate back to that. We've got to create a new normal. And we've got to be thinking of what are the system changes and what are the things we need to create to make things better. And finally, and especially important here again, is just for those of us leading in America, we have to make sure that racial equity is at the center of our response and recovery, that the effects of this work have predominantly hit certain communities. So our advocacy and work needs to be focused on those who've been most affected and continue to be most affected and historically have been most affected. And so I share this just to start, just to kind of ground myself and ground everyone in the situation we're facing today, and recognize that leading right now is more of a challenge than usual, and that we have to, as leaders, be present with other people, be empathetic, be supportive, and be taking care of ourselves and our families and our work. And so I hope all of you are doing okay. I hope and wish everybody as great health and well-being as can be over the next year as we hopefully work through this and get to that new normal. So now let me turn to Collective. I've been kind of global. John Lennon said, think globally, act locally. And I guess now what I want to do is bring us back to this work of collective impact and what it means to do this work in a community. And for me, the story begins, I was on something called the White House Council for Community Solutions. We were part of President Obama's Domestic Policy Council. And our job was to determine how are communities best solving problems. And we began looking at what solutions would be for some of the challenges that we face. And one of the things that hit me was lots of people were talking about, let's find these evidence-based programs, these successful models, and let's scale and grow them across the country. And something was gnawing at me about that and bugging me about it. And it really hit me in April of 2010. The headline of my local newspaper was that African-American students in my state had the worst reading scores in the entire country. And as I looked at that headline, it just really struck me. But then I noticed that afternoon I got a newsletter from one of the largest youth-serving organizations in the city, boasting and promoting all of the outcomes it was achieving with the 15,000 children they serve. And that disconnect really hit me. If you're achieving all these outcomes with these 15,000 kids, how do we still have these terrible results at the same level? So I went back to the council and said, instead of looking for a great program, have we thought about looking for, is there a city where the graduation rate from high school is up? or that the teen pregnancy rate's lower, or where crime's gone down. Or let's look for those communities where actually the number for the whole population has changed and see what's there. And as we began this exploration, this article came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called Collective Impact, and it coined the term. And I want to point out that they did not invent collective impact. They were describing something they found in other communities where people had asked the same question I was asking. They had asked, why do we have so many programs doing great work, but we don't see it adding up to population change? And as we began our exploration from the White House, we looked at 22 cities that had moved a population level measure by 10 points or more. And we found a lot of the same things that John and Mark found in their article they called Collective Impact. And one of those happened to be in my backyard of Milwaukee, where I live, my hometown. And in Milwaukee, we had for over 20 years the highest teen pregnancy rate in the country. In fact, in 2006, when this effort began, the teen pregnancy rate in Milwaukee was 2.5 times the national average. Think about that, 250% of what the average was for the whole country. It was just off the charts. And our United Way and our city health department organized a summit of all the people who worked on this, because they made grants, they supported work, people achieved outcomes, there was good work happening in the community, but nothing was changing. And when they brought everyone together, one of the first things they recognized as they began the summit is almost everyone worked with girls. And they realized there was another part of the problem. The other thing is that they found out some data that they hadn't really looked at together before. One was that the majority of teen births in our city, the father was over 18, and they realized there was another problem that no one was talking about. But together, they identified 3 strategies, and they decided to do those 3 strategies at scale throughout the community to get the school system, churches, nonprofits, leaders, everyone to do these things. And one was a major public relations campaign with advertisements, that were all over the community. And I have to ask you at this point, I'm just going to move my image for a moment, which you might think the most controversial ad was. And what I'll tell you is that this is true, and it's an Only in America story. There's an association of people who are snake owners who don't want to increase the kinds and types of snakes they can import domestically as pets. And they don't like snakes to be presented in the media as devils or predators. And so they began protesting at the United Way. But the point of this is that after all of these efforts, the teen pregnancy rate in Milwaukee went down over 70% over the next 12 years. It's gone from 2.5 times the national average to almost national average actually in the 14 years. These data are a few years old still. And that's what collective impact is about. It's not about let's all collaborate a little differently and combine our programs. It's about what would it take to move a population change? What would it take to move the needle in a substantial way for the whole community? How can we organize all the leaders and organizations it would take to do that and create a strategy that can move that? So when we think of collective impact, we typically think of a few elements. The first is a common agenda, that there's a strategy that's at the scale and complexity necessary to move the needle. And I'll talk more about what that looks like in a moment. Then once you have that strategy, you have to have shared measurement. You have to have a way to measure your progress and success, not so you can write a report about it or write a massive evaluation, but so you can manage it. So in the early years of that teen pregnancy initiative in Milwaukee, the African American and white rates were falling faster than the Latino rate. And they knew that because they were gathering and sharing data on a regular basis. And as a result of that, they ended up shifting their strategy, deploying a new task force and work on the south side of our city, which was predominantly Latino. And within a few years, that rate began falling in line with the others. And that's why shared measurement is important. So you have data that you can look at so you can adapt and adjust your strategy and work as you go to make sure you're doing the right things to move the needle. The third is aligned action, like figuring out who do we all need to bring together and integrate the work of in order to achieve that result. And sometimes it might include partners that you don't think of, but it's thinking of who all could help us move these strategies that we've identified. Then we have to continuously engage those who are at the table, whether it's leaders or community members. We have to communicate and host meetings and do things that keep people connected, engaged, and active in working on our solution. And managing all of this is a backbone staff. The recognition that we need staff whose job it is to facilitate and coordinate the action of the group. I would argue these were what John and Mark in their original article called the 5 conditions. I call them elements of collective impact. But I argue strongly that there's a 6th element that's as important or more important than the rest, and that's the leadership culture. Because to do all this work well means that you have to lead in a different kind of way and collaborate in a different kind of way than organizations and public institutions and others are used to. But I'm going to talk more about culture in a moment, but I want to take a moment to talk about the shared agenda and the kind of strategy that moves collective impact forward. And typically the way programs create strategies is most of our programs that serve the community have some sort of outcomes they use to measure their success. And as they look at that population change North Star that they hope to achieve, they know that they're not big enough to get there, but their hope is that with the other programs in their community who are achieving similar outcomes, that they can get there. And a lot of people look at collective impact and say, well, maybe if we just coordinate our work and add it all up, that together that will produce, voila, through some source of magic, population change, but it doesn't. What we end up having is what I said at the beginning. We have lots of organizations achieving outcomes, but that shift between our outcomes and the population change often doesn't happen. So the way that I look at developing a common agenda for collective impact is using something called result-based accountability, which begins with the idea of having a very clear result, understand who your population is, and have an indicator to measure success. So I'm going to use an example of infant mortality that I worked on in a community. So the result would be to decrease infant mortality by 20% in this city over a 10-year period. When they looked at the population, what they found is most of the infant mortality was a result, was in 7 zip codes in the city out of over 20. And so the focus of the population is in these 7 zip codes. The indicator that we'll use to measure success is that infant mortality number. Then we have to really dig into that population more. Who are they? What do we know about the populations? What do we know about disparities within the population? Are there some populations, again, like in these zip codes, in this case was predominantly African-American women. And when we got down to it, we realized that there were 28,000 women of childbearing age in these 7 zip codes who were African-American. And also that there were about 1,200 live births a year from these zip codes. So now we have a sense of what the number is. Often we talk in percentages and it gets abstract. And this way we know, well, if we have to make change with 28,000 people in order to impact the births of 1,200 children a year. Then we have to ask ourselves, what are the factors that most support or impede infant mortality? And in this case, a lot of concern was around safe sleep and babies who had died in bed, because every time that happens, it's in the news. And that's what people thought most of the problem was. But when we looked at the data, what we found was that in this community, 60% of the births were a result of prematurity. 25% was a result of birth defects, and only about 15% happened in the home. But most of the programs working on this were trying to address what was happening in the home, and most of the work actually should be directed, which is why we have to do that factor analysis and really use data to test our assumptions and beliefs and understand what are the things that seem to most get in the way of our success, our result. Then we have to determine which of those factors could we have the most influence over and would have the most influence on moving our result. And so we identify a set of kind of priorities that we say, this is the set of work that we believe we have the most chance as a coalition at moving, that would have the best chance on moving that indicator and result. And that's where we build our strategies. Then for each strategy, we have performance measures, and we have to ask ourselves, how much of that strategy do we need? Like, so if we're going to do a big education outreach campaign, we know we need to reach 28,000 people. That's our how much. How will we know it's working well? How can we assess that it's being delivered with quality, that people are experiencing that? And so maybe we do some surveys of people who've had outreach, or maybe we're doing some type of community information gathering. And then we have to ask ourselves the third question: how much? How do we know it's working well? And how do we know it's contributing to the result? Where are we seeing that women coming in the hospital are recognizing that some of that information they got from that strategy is actually making a difference? And so we have to have performance measures that tell us all those things. And getting that data on a regular basis is what allows us to manage our strategies, make sure we're doing the same right strategies, or find out that we need to shift strategies or make changes and adapt as we go. And finally, once we're clear on our results, the indicator, the population who we have to help, the strategies we're targeting toward them, the performance measures, then we ask ourselves who all is going to be needed to implement this. And this is important because I think a lot of people come into Collective Impact imagining that they build a table and the question is, how do we coordinate the work of the table? And actually the way Collective Impact should work is not to coordinate our existing work, but to figure out what's the work that really needs to happen and who needs to do that. And that might mean that people continue or expand work they're already doing. It might mean people have to shift from doing one type of programming to another and change their work. It might mean bringing new players and new groups to the table who you didn't have involved in the planning to begin. The idea is that the form of the collective impact should follow the function, meaning the strategy, not the other way around. So it's not that you build the collective impact and then create a strategy. It's that you build a strategy and then you develop the form, the collective impact that's going to support that, which many of the people who built that strategy are part of, but also others. So that's what I mean when I talk about building that common agenda and strategy. But I would argue there's a great quote from the leadership guru, Peter Drucker, who said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, that you can build a great strategy, but if you don't build a culture for people to work together well, that strategy is not going to be successful. So I'm going to talk now about what it means to build that leadership strategy. I wrote a book about a decade ago called Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up. And it doesn't mean that everyone should be in charge at the same time. What Everyone Leads means is that leadership's like a muscle, and it's like any other muscle in our body. It only gets stronger with exercise and practice. And the goal of any organization or community is, how do you build the collective leadership muscle of the organization and community? Because everyone has that muscle. It can be built among all kinds of people. But the success of any organization or group is how you build the collective leadership muscle of the group to get things done. The way that we define leadership is based on three ideas. First, to think of leadership as an action many can take, not just a position few can hold. When we shift our thinking from the noun leader to the verb lead, it opens up the possibility of who can participate and what it means. The second is really the essence of leadership. Leadership in its essence is an act of responsibility. It's stepping up and owning a result, being willing to do what it takes, work with who you have to work with, learn what you have to learn in order to get things done with others. And that's why you can't really be given leadership or are entitled to leadership. It's a responsibility you have to own and do. And the third is really about values, because when you think of a leader you admire or someone you love working with on your team or the best boss you ever had, it's not about just they were technically good at their work. It's usually the values they brought, that they listened to others, they collaborated well, they held themselves and others to the same standards and to high standards. They were ethical. It's about values, which I would call the secret sauce of leadership. It's what really holds it together. And so if we think of leadership as an action, as about responsibility and values, it allows us to think differently about leadership within our coalition. But I'm going to tell a story that I think illustrates this notion of collective leadership, and everyone leads better than any other story I know. And it's a story that you may know somewhat. It's a story that's very foundational in the way America understands itself, or tries to understand itself. But it's a story that even when I tell in the United States, many people don't really know. And it's a story of Mrs. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which helped launch the modern civil rights movement in 1955 and launched the career of Martin Luther King as well. And to many of us growing up in the United States, what we learn is that they took these heroic actions, that Rosa Parks sat and Martin Luther King stood, everyone marched with him and change happened. But it's a more complicated story, and it's a story of collective impact. And let me start with Mrs. Parks. Rosa Parks was a lifelong rebel and radical. As a child, she got into fights when she was mistreated. She always stood up for herself. In 1932, she fell in love with her husband, Raymond, who was a barber. He had become active in a case called the Scottsboro 9 case, in which 9 young men had been accused of rape falsely. And he became a community organizer in the effort. And she said he was the first person radical enough for her to marry, that she fell in love with his activism. In 1943, they went to their first NAACP meeting. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, was the premier civil rights organization in the first half of the 20th century. And it was an organization primarily of the professional class of African Americans. It wasn't an organization really for working class people. But Rosa's friend Johnny Carr told her that E.D. Nixon was running to be president of the local chapter. He was a porter on trains, and if elected, would be the first working class president of an NAACP chapter in the country. So she and Raymond went to their first meeting, and sure enough, Nixon gets elected president. But no one runs to be secretary of the NAACP that night, and Rosa Parks is the only woman in the audience at the meeting. And so at her first meeting, she gets elected secretary, a position she held for the next 12 years. And the thing to hold on for a moment, it was her job as secretary to document all the cases of mistreatment, discrimination, abuse, and terrorism in the community for over a decade. Through the NAACP, she went to trainings in Georgia and Florida by the master organizer, Ella Baker, who is the national field director of the NAACP, and had been building leaders throughout the South for an emerging movement. And Baker became a mentor of Rosa Parks and, among other things, encouraged her to create a youth council in Montgomery in which she would work with young people, meet with them on Sunday afternoons, and work with them on ways they could stand up to segregation. Then one day she was working in her job as a seamstress for Clifford and Virginia Durer, who were the town's kind of leading white liberals. And they were talking to her about her civil rights work when they encouraged her to go to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. It was a training center that ran trainings in nonviolent civil disobedience for diverse groups of activists from the South. And when Rosa Parks expressed interest in going, the Durers actually raised money to sponsor her to go to Highlander. And Virginia Durer took the bus with Rosa to Knoxville, Tennessee, to make sure she got there safely, because traveling across the South as an African-American woman was dangerous at the time. At Highlander, she was trained by Septima Clark and Miles Horton, who also became important mentors in her life, and began corresponding with and supporting her work in Montgomery. And they really saw her as a key emerging leader in the movement. And she said that Highlander had a profound impact on her life. She said it was the first time she had lived in an interracial community where everyone was treated equally. She says the first time she woke up in the morning and smelled bacon and realized white people were cooking it for her. Then she met a young lawyer, Fred Gray. He was 24 years old. He was the first African-American lawyer in Montgomery, Alabama, the second in the state. And she took him under her wing and brought him to lunch every week and brought all these cases she had been documenting as secretary of the NAACP and working with him on which ones they could turn into legal cases to prosecute under the law. And then in February of 1955, Claudette Colvin, who was a 15-year-old member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. Now, when I speak in the U.S., especially in front of an audience, I always ask how many people know her name, and if a few hands go up, that's it. People don't know this. Rosa Parks, Virginia Durer, and others fought that they should use her case to challenge the segregated system in Montgomery. But the lawyers, who were all men, decided she wasn't sympathetic enough. They said she was a teen and people won't believe her. She allegedly resisted arrest, that there were rumors she was sexually active, she was too dark-skinned, she was too poor. They had all these excuses for why, but they decided she wouldn't be a sympathetic enough character, and they did not take her case. 6 weeks later, in October, 8 months later, in October of 1955, Mary Louise Smith, an 18-year-old member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus and was arrested. Once again, Rosa and others fought that they should take this case. The lawyers determined again she wouldn't be sympathetic. Her family was too poor. Her father was a drunk. They decided she wouldn't be able to win a case, and they did not take it. 6 weeks later, on Thursday night, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus and was arrested. And I should pause here for a moment to note two things. It was the second time she had been thrown off that bus by that bus driver for refusing to move. It wasn't the first time she had done this. And secondly, it was when she died, the obituaries in the major American newspapers and even the White House proclamation on the 100th anniversary of her birth described her as an accidental activist or someone who inadvertently started a movement. How accidental does she sound? So Edie Nixon and Clifford of Virginia Dewar go to get her out of jail and spend the next few hours with her, talking with her and Raymond about the idea of using her case as the one to challenge segregation in Montgomery. And she and Raymond know they'll lose everything, but they make the courageous choice. They decide to go forward, and they did. They lost their jobs, they lost their house, they lost a lot in this fight, but they made the courageous choice. And so Edie Nixon called Fred Gray and asked him to represent his friend Rosa in court that Monday. And then he called Joanna Robinson. Joanna Robinson headed a group called the Women's Political Council, which was an association of African-American professional women who'd been urging the male-dominated NAACP for years to organize a bus boycott. And he calls Joanna and says, we're going to do a bus boycott Monday. Can you get the word out? And again, this is Thursday night. Joanna is an English professor at Alabama State University, a historically black college in the state of Alabama, but a state institution. But she goes and overnight prints 35,000 flyers. Now, if I asked any of you, and the great technology Finland has today to make 35,000 copies tonight, you would freak out. It would be hard to do. She did this with a hand crank overnight using state equipment, state ink, and state paper in the state of Alabama. And that morning, Friday morning, all the women from the council met her and they fanned every bus stop in Montgomery with flyers announcing the boycott. She made another 17,000 flyers that day that they brought with them at the afternoon rush hour to make sure everyone knew about the boycott. And then, and this is absolutely true in how it happened, Edie Nixon called Reverend Ralph Abernathy at Holt Street Baptist Church and asked him if he could convene all of the pastors in town for a meeting Friday afternoon. So on Sunday from the pulpit, they would all call for the boycott from their churches. And he says, well, I've got a better idea. There's this new young pastor in town and no one knows him. Let's do the meeting at his church because if he gets run out of town, no one will notice. And that is literally how 26-year-old Martin Luther King was drafted into the civil rights movement. Again, he was 26 years old. He was new to town. It was his first pastorship. The pastors met at his church that afternoon, and they were impressed with him, but they saw him as the new young man in town. That one white pastor attended that meeting, Robert Krayitz, who happened to be the pastor who hosted Rosa Parks Youth Council, and his home was bombed a few weeks later. And I have to note, he just died in the last few days at the age of 92. So we wish him to rest in peace and power. That Monday, everyone marched. Everyone walked to school. They walked to church. They walked everywhere. And that night, they had a mass meeting at First Street Baptist Church, and over 5,000 people showed up. And they asked the community to vote if they wanted to continue the boycott, and the community voted unanimously that they wanted to continue the boycott. And as they began the boycott, they decided to create an organization that night to manage it called the Montgomery Improvement Association. And Rufus Lewis was a business owner. He had been a winning football coach, and he had been a rival of Edie Nixon's. He had lost several elections to Nixon to run the NAACP, and he didn't want Nixon to run this new organization, but he didn't think he could beat him. So he hatches a plan with Joanna Robinson. He goes before the community and says, we're too divided as a community. We have too many factions. And if we're going to hold together through this movement, we need someone completely neutral to lead us. And he nominates his young new pastor, Martin Luther King. He's a deacon at his church with hopes of pulling strings behind the scenes, but he nominates Martin Luther King to be that neutral leader, which is how King becomes head of the MIA that night. King then called his father, who was the most prominent pastor in Atlanta, who connected him to a pastor in Louisiana where there had been a bus boycott. This wasn't actually the first of them. And that pastor said, people walk for maybe a week, and then you got to figure out how to get them everywhere. King appointed then Lewis to become a transportation chair, and Lewis organized a 350-car carpool that transported the entire community to school, church, work, and shopping for 12 months. To raise money for this, two women, Inez Ricks and Georgia Gilmore, created competing clubs of women who made and sold food every week, and they would bring money to the mass meeting to support the gas costs and all the tickets the police kept giving the drivers. Then Ella Baker took Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money from donors to the NAACP. The Hordens and the Doers hit up all the people who supported the Highlander community to support Montgomery. And then Bayard Rustin came to town. Bayard Rustin was a controversial figure. Edie Nixon, as I mentioned, was a porter on trains and a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, which was the largest African-American union. Its leader, A. Philip Randolph, was really dean of civil rights leadership in the first half of the 20th century. And his master organizer and strategist was Bayard Rustin. But Rustin was controversial. He had been the campus organizer for the Communist Party of America in the 1930s, which now that we're in the 1950s was especially not popular. He had then gone to India and become a follower of Gandhi. He sat out World War II in jail as a pacifist, and he was an openly gay black man in 1955 New York City. They called him Brother Outsider, and there's a great documentary about him by that name in many books. But Rustin was the genius strategist of the movement, and he goes down to Montgomery to meet with Edie Nixon. And Nixon tells him about this young pastor, Dr. King, and they go to King's home. And King has a man on his front porch with a shotgun, a man on his roof with a shotgun, and Dr. King's carrying a sidearm. At that point, after they had been attacked several times marching, the marchers began carrying weapons. And Rustin sits down with King and Nixon and talks about the idea of using this movement to practice a Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience campaign. And King had read Gandhi in graduate school and was quite excited by the idea. And so Rustin said, first, no more marching with weapons. And he said, secondly, 85 members of the Montgomery Improvement Association have been indicted by the local police. Can you organize them to put on their Sunday best, march down to the jail, and turn themselves in, which they did. It was the first mass civil disobedience of the movement. But they were worried that this gay pacifist from New York would be found behind the scenes in Montgomery. So Rustin moves into a hotel room in Birmingham, Alabama, where he coaches and counsels King every day through the movement. And for the next 13 years, he's the man who organized a famous March on Washington and much else. And was a mentor of King throughout. But Rosa Parks had been an officer in the NAACP, so in the end, they decided she also wouldn't make a sympathetic character to win a national case. So yet another woman who had refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and been arrested. And again, another name most Americans don't know, Aurelia Browder. It was her case that went up to the US Supreme Court that overturned segregation in America. So the question I always ask is, who was the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? And I love this story because I think it really illustrates how leaders from all backgrounds and experience can contribute to a common strategy to achieve a result. And to me, this is collective impact. They created a population level change, and they created a strategy and brought all kinds of people around a table in order to solve it. And everyone was able to take leadership and make their contribution to that result. And so I always ask, how do we create leadership tables and collective impacts where lots of people can step up, own responsibility, and lead? The second point about leadership is values. And I'm going to walk through 5 values that I think are really critical for doing this work today. The first is being asset-based. And it's predicated on the idea, the age-old idea of the glass. Is it half empty or half full? And the correct answer is yes. This glass is like me. It's like every one of you and everyone you work with and serve. Every single one of us have fullness. We all have things that make us great family members, great friends, great workers, great leaders. We also have emptiness. We have things we don't do well, mistakes we've made, regrets we hold. Yet often, people who do service and community are viewed as full and are asked to go into communities that are considered empty to help people who've often been labeled by their emptiness with the notion that our job is to fill them up with some of our fullness. We think that at best is arrogant and at worst oppressive. We think great leaders are those that when they look at community, when they work with people in community, they always start with the fullness. If you think about those people who are closest to you, your closest friends and family, they know all your emptiness. And they're the people whom you would share your deepest challenges and regrets with. But you do that because you know no matter what you share with them, they will always see you and define you by your fullness. And it's the same thing when community members know that we see their fullness, their community's fullness, they work with us in a different way. So many people, when we talk about some of our most challenged communities, get a mental map activated in their brain with all of these ideas: addiction, violence, poverty, gangs, illiteracy, teen parents, mental illness. We think about all the stuff. It's what forms a lot of the way people write need statements or talk about these vulnerable communities. But I would argue that you could create a different mental map of those same exact communities that has all these things, because in every community you can find all that, you can find all of this. You can find people who are faithful, who are entrepreneurial, who are in service to each other. You can find teachers and carpenters and business owners, people who are family oriented, people who are students. There's parks, there's hardworking people and skilled people. There's veterans and people who are athletic and enterprising and healthy. You've got all of this. Both are true. The question is, if you only see one, all your solutions are going to be doing work to community. If you see the other, you know how to do work with community because you see what assets they have. You see how you can work differently. And when you start to look at community this way, you notice that there's a woman who checks in on the young mothers in the neighborhood, and you see her as part of public health. You notice there's a man on the playground after school every day watching the kids to make sure they're safe, and you realize he's part of youth development in the community. You realize there's an elder in the community who carries a lot of history and checks in on people, and he's a true community builder. And we start to notice this. And then when we're thinking about solutions, we think, how do we activate those assets, not just programs and organizations and government, but people and the assets they hold and the ways they come together? How do we utilize that to support our work? And that's when we see a literacy program partner with Black barbershops in Milwaukee to get books to kids during the summer, or we see a program focused on suicide among farmers, working with seed dealers and mechanics and bankers to help them spot signs of of depression among the farmers they work with so they can help them get access to services. It's when we start to think of all those assets, we start thinking of ways that we can do work with community or supporting work by community and not just doing work to community or for community. And that's what it means to be asset-based, to have that understanding. It doesn't mean that the need isn't there. The question is, do we fully understand that glass is half full and half empty? And how do we start working with the fullness? Because the more you work with and build on the fullness, the easier it is to address that emptiness. The second is around inclusion and equity, which are terms that become quite prominent in social policy, philanthropy, and service in the United States in recent years. And the way I tend to look at it is the concept of a lens or a mirror. And the lens is this, that whenever we're working on a problem in community, we need to take a lens to look at the data and understand, are there disparities in our community by race, by gender, by geography, by ability, by what other status? But are there ways that different populations are achieving at different levels than the whole? And when we see that there are disparities between populations, instead of providing the same service to everybody, what we probably have to do is target our services and solutions differently to communities who are further behind by providing more resources or different strategies to move everybody to that common result. This is often called targeted universalism. But the basic idea is, first, disaggregate our data, understand where there are disparities between our result and different populations, and recognize we might have to work with different populations differently to move everyone to our common result. The mirror is that when we're making decisions about community, we have to ask ourselves, do we have equity at our table that's making decisions? And what I mean by that is, how many of us live in the neighborhoods we're serving, or even have lived there or have family members who live there? How demographically reflective is our decision-making group of the population we're serving? Or do we have people who bring other forms of difference to our table? How many of us have personal lived experience on the issue we're working on, or even family members with personal lived experience? How many of us work directly and with that population every day and are in direct relationship with the population we serve, or even supervise those who do? And what I find too often here is a lot of people making decisions at tables about what's going to happen in communities are all on the outside of the circle. I would also argue, by the way, if everyone's inside the green, you might lack perspective. You might be too close to it. You want a mix of perspectives. You want what I call content expertise, people who have knowledge and awareness and expertise on the issues and are able to bring research and things like that to the table and experience. But you also want context expertise, those people who know the community, know how things work on the ground, how people feel, who's trusted, things like that. And you need both. And to do that, you have to build a table that's aware. And so when I talk about practicing equity, it's both at the level of the outcomes, making sure that we're disaggregating data and differentiating our work to different populations, but it's also the level of who's making the decision about what the outcomes are and how we differentiate them, and making sure that we're also practicing equity at our tables. The third is about collaboration, which is all about trust. They say that collaboration moves at the speed of trust, but the basic idea here is that the absence of conflict is not a positive measure of collaboration. But I'm going to qualify that. There's two kinds of conflict. There's conflict which happens at the table where we debate and maybe disagree about ideas, where we hold each other accountable, where we give each other constructive criticism, where we really work through the challenges of our work to get to better learning and solutions. And that is what I would call constructive conflict. Then there's destructive conflict, which is when we leave the meeting, go outside and complain about everyone in the meeting and what just happened. And that produces nothing of value. And the question is, how do you bring the parking lot conversation into the room? And the way that you do that is by building trust. And how do you build trust in a collective impact? I would argue there's a few ways. One is the meeting structure and culture itself, that the way you organize the meetings and facilitate meetings and build a culture around the collective impact starts to build trust in the process. You have to build relationships with people. You have to get to know people as people and not just as roles. If all we do is introduce ourselves by name, title, organization, and you got that government grant I thought I was supposed to get, I now hate you. But if we get to know each other as people and build relationships with people, then we can move through some of those organizational interests and start collaborating as humans. We should have clear roles and responsibilities and core values for our group that we agree on, we help create, and we're accountable to. We have to have intentional and transparent processes. There can't be a meeting before the meeting that's the real meeting, or a small group that's really making decisions behind the scenes and the rest of us kind of know there's something else going on. You have to have that transparency and that intention of holding a space that's truly inclusive and collaborative. You have to name and negotiate interests that a lot of us at the table do have interests. We do have, we might be competing for grants or attention or other things. And instead of making that a bad thing, let's just talk about it and figure out how we work through that and what's going to happen if some of us don't get grants. Will we still be at the table? And finally, we have to do what we call surfacing elephants in the room. We've got to have the difficult conversations and build our muscle in doing that. And but if we don't have the difficult conversations, they only get more difficult. The elephants only get bigger until you get them out of the room. And so these are ways we can build that form of trust and collaborative culture that can serve us well. The fourth is around continuous learning. And here I like to tell a story about a decade ago. There's a foundation called Echoing Green that funds social entrepreneurs who are starting new nonprofits around the world. And they asked me to share with them how I built my previous organization, Public Allies. And I began writing the speech about all the things we did and realized that really wouldn't help them much. And so I created a presentation called The Worst Practices of Social Entrepreneurship. And in it, I documented the 10 biggest mistakes I had made, and that if I could go back and do it again, I would as a leader of an organization. And before sharing this publicly, I thought I should share it with our staff. But it's kind of daunting because the first slide of the deck was called Things I Suck At. And it was this list. And the reason was because I realized if I had been more clear about what I was not good at my emptiness, earlier in my leadership journey, I would have collaborated better. I would have hired better. I would have delegated better. I would have been less defensive. It would have been much easier for people to work with me. it just would have been a much better leadership experience. And I would have known where I need to grow and where I need to focus, where I need help. But not owning these things got me into a lot of trouble. But it was scary to put this list in front of my employees. And then something happened. Everyone in the room was nodding. And the reason is because the things you suck at aren't a secret. If you're always late, everyone knows it. If you talk too much in meetings, everyone knows it. If you say nothing in the meeting and get on the phone with 3 people afterward and complain about it all, everyone knows you're doing that. Whatever it is, everyone knows. And as a leader, you have 2 choices. You can either own these things, which creates the possibility that people can talk about them with you, give you feedback, offer you help, collaborate with you, or you don't own these things and they'll talk about it without you. Why are we in the parking lot complaining about Jim from the meeting? We're usually doing that because we don't believe we can give Jim that feedback. But if Jim said, listen, I have a tendency to talk too much and dominate meetings. If I'm doing that, let me know. Then in the meeting, we say, Jim, can you pass the mic? Or we can, and he might be defensive at first, but he's given us that permission. It doesn't have to be a parking lot conversation. We can have it in the room. I think the key thing in leadership is to have confidence in what you bring, that fullness again. Have confidence in what you bring and humility about what you don't. And if you can hold that, it's a great foundation as a leader. It's why we have to collaborate. None of us has the whole package. All of us only have a piece of it, which is why we need each other. And finally is the 5th value, integrity, which is really about how we be true to our own purpose and values. Each of us has a reason why we care and do this work, how we hold ourselves accountable to those we work with, and for the promises we make, and how we hold ourselves ultimately accountable for the population we serve and the change we're producing. And really, integrity is our personal backbone. It's about how we integrate and hold all of our accountability. Because if leadership is an act of responsibility, then the price of that is accountability. And as leaders, there is no leadership without accountability. And again, it's accountability to our own purpose and values, accountability to our colleagues for the promises we make, for the things we say we're going to do, and ultimately accountability for the people whose lives we're trying to help and the change we're trying to create. And so if we understand collective impact as building this results-based common agenda where we have performance measures that we can share and measure and adjust as we go, that we're connecting our activity and aligning our work, that we're engaging people on a regular basis through a collaborative, facilitated set of meetings, and we're building a leadership culture that supports engagement of community on assets, that is equitable and inclusive in terms of both our outcomes and our decision-making, builds an environment that supports trust and collaboration, acknowledges continuous learning and creates an environment where we can be vulnerable and recognize where we have to learn and grow, and that holds accountability and integrity so that we're making sure we're getting things done on behalf of community. It's that which supports excellent collective impact. So I want to thank you all again so much for inviting me to present here today, to be with all of you. I look forward to the question and answer. And boy, I hope to get out there someday and meet some of you in person. It would be so wonderful. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your conference.